So Brian, looks like you're up first. What is the latest position regarding ownership to middle of the road and landowner consent for grid planning applications?
Thanks for that, Eamon. I suppose I probably should have said it in the talk, but I suppose the different strategies that have been taken by different developers really comes down to the appetite for risk. If you want to be absolutely certain that you have a strong, robust planning application, I would have to advise that you go along the road and secure the consent of everybody that has everybody whose folio extends either to the middle of the road or extends to the side of the road that you want to lay your cable along. I suppose the practical reality is that that's virtually impossible, because for a 10, 12, 15 kilometre grid connection, you're talking about needing the consents of hundreds of individuals. And it has seemed to be somewhat of a nonsense for the last while that you potentially need the consent of those individuals to apply for planning permission when you may not actually need their consent to carry out the work subsequently, if you avail of the powers that are available under the Electricity Act. And I suppose that, with my colleagues in the Planning Committee, is what we have suggested to the Department of Housing and Planning as a very simple fix to the planning and development regulations, whereby you could essentially, instead of having to tick the box as the owner or the occupier of the property that you're seeking permission on, you could tick the box to say other, and the other would say that the works in time would be carried out by a statutory undertaker using the powers that would be available to that statutory undertaker. So the latest position is, if you have no appetite for risk through the planning process, you secure the consents of everybody along the road, but I would wish you the best of luck in doing that. And if you do have some appetite for risk, then you can maybe fulfill some of that appetite by securing the likes of the letter of consent from the Roads Authority, even though if it ends up in front of a judge, it's hard to know where you will stand with the likes of that.
Great. Yeah, I would just say some planning authorities are actually quite pragmatic and will give you a letter of consent, which is quite useful. Okay, so Brian again as well. Planning reform, should we also be pushing for extra resources for An Bord Pleanála? If we can improve their capacity, we can get projects through faster.
Yeah, earlier this summer, myself and David and Sinead O'Malley from Quilcha and Dennis Devan from IWEA as well met David Walsh, who's the chair of An Bord Pleanála, and Rachel Kenny, who's the head of the inspectorate, and we put this matter to them. They appeared quite comfortable in the resources that they had. They explained that they're in a position to request the resources or the monies needed to increase their resources on an annual basis. And we, on behalf of the industry, were trying to make the point that there are a lot of applications coming, and they shouldn't take the rate of applications or appeals over the last number of years as being indicative of what's going to come at them in the future. But I think the board have obviously seen the learnings and the advantages of forming a dedicated unit to handle the likes of the strategic housing developments, and hence why they formed more recently the unit to handle the strategic infrastructure developments. And I think the average of whatever it was, 32 weeks, I think we should be pretty happy with that, as long as we continue to see those sorts of timeframes for decisions into the future. But undoubtedly, they are going to be handling more applications, and we'd always like them to have more resources, and we'll continue to put it to them in future meetings.
Okay, what is the panel's view on repowering and the planning and community engagement considerations which should be taken into account? I'm going to go to Pat, first of all, for this.
Yeah, I think in terms of repowering, I'm not so sure it'll be, in one sense, that it'll be that much different from bringing a wind farm project forward, in that you're going to be looking at significantly higher tip heights and a very different proposal to what is there. So I would say that we would have to engage with people in terms of the project that we're bringing forward. But what you would be hoping is that all of the misinformation in terms of the myths regarding wind energy, that at least you wouldn't have to be dealing with them. So, yeah.
Yeah, I dealt with one in the UK, and we just approached it, like you said, exactly as we would a new project. And at least there was some consolation in that we were reducing the number of turbines, so people were quite happy about that. And I mean, now in Ireland going forward, there will be the €2 per megawatt hour, so that might change people's attitudes a little bit. So actually the next one was a question I actually had noted down. Is there a risk in engaging too early? If we can't answer their questions, the hardliners will say we're hiding the truth or being evasive.
I think there is a point that you need to get in terms of having your project having a certain level of design. And I suppose what we found is that you have to have a design layout to actually go and talk to people with. So to go out and present a study area and say that you're considering something within this area, we actually did that and very quickly went back with a design, because people, whilst they would accept that, okay, you may not have it all worked out, and I think that people appreciate the fact that you're coming at that stage. If you just have an area on a map with a blank space, it doesn't give them anything to, let's say, form their opinions or thoughts on. And by presenting a design layout, it actually allows people to form considered views of how they feel that the project would work. So, yes, there is a point that's too early, but I feel there's also a point that's too late.
Yeah. Okay, I'll go to David. For people looking to acquire a wind farm, what is a prudent assumption for people to forecast for rates?
The $1 million question someone asked. Ultimately, it's sort of been an ever-climbing exercise. If you'd have asked me this question maybe 2 years ago, I probably would have said to you somewhere between about 16 and 18,000 euros a megawatt as rates. I think as we go, we're pushing definitely towards 20. Ultimately, it depends who's asking and where, but if you're a bank looking to stress test a project, you can probably stress test to about 25,000 a megawatt now. It's gotten that bad. If you're a buyer in the market looking for something maybe more realistic on the poorest end, I'd be going somewhere around about the 20,000 mark. But it's scary stuff, considering 5 years ago there wasn't a wind farm in the country that was paying more than 10,000 euros a megawatt. So it's a massive, massive increase.
Okay, and Brian, with the new eggs in mind, would you see financial involvement being used for residential receptors where there is a breach in the new noise limits?
I would, and I think that the way to maybe look at this is to look at all the research that has been done in relation to people's attitudes towards wind farms before they were built and then after they became operational. And whether that's the work that came out of IWEA Galway or out of Scotland or other international studies, you know, the initial fears or misconceptions about what the wind farm will mean for local residents, in the vast majority of cases, are unfounded, and the fears around those are unfounded. So I think if you take that scenario where somebody thought it was going to be maybe worse than it was, and you go back to them subsequently and say, well, now that it's not as bad as you thought it was going to be, we're also going to offer you some money. I would think in 99 cases out of 100, they're going to accept it. So, you know, in terms of the new wind energy guidelines, we're all well aware that there were issues in relation to noise on a small number of projects. But I think the fear that the industry has is that those small number of projects are going to have a disproportionate impact now on the very, very many and certainly the majority of projects that have been quite good neighbours or perfectly fine neighbours. And therefore, if there is a restrictive or an overly restrictive noise level introduced in the wind energy guidelines, some of the €2 per megawatt hour community contribution may well end up going towards near neighbour schemes, which might allow people to accept a slightly higher level. But I don't think we're expecting them to accept a higher noise level than other people are already happily accepting and living with in the hundreds of operational projects that we have around the country where there hasn't been a noise complaint.
Okay, thanks, Brian. Okay, in the interest of time, I'm just going to take this last question. What is your experience of local communities wanting a shareholding in projects as opposed to a community fund? Pat?
The community investment is part of RES, and we've incorporated it into our engagement process and floated it out there and looked for feedback on in terms of people who may be interested in investing. And I suppose what we found is that when you're talking to people and asking them what do they want from the project, there's very few say, well, put their hand up and say, well, I want to invest my money in it to get a return from it. They're basically saying, tell us more about this €2 megawatt hour and this community benefit fund. So that really would be the big feedback that we would have gotten, is that, look, it's to be welcomed, and everything that will help us to be welcomed, and I suppose we'll be looking forward to see more detail from the department and how it might work. But it's the community benefit fund really that you get the traction on.
Yeah, I had the same experience in Scotland. We offered investment in our projects and we had very little take up. So it'll be interesting to see what the appetite is in Ireland though. Okay, so it's lunchtime, so I'll let you go, but if you'll just join me in thanking the speakers one last time. So.